one of those situations, and then you will measure them. Not only that, you can measure the interaction between them.
Because really, you could test just what you said. The higher level of engagement, the higher level of presence, the lower level of, user feels engaged, then the less it's going to be present. They're two separate constructs, so you've got to be able to tease them out.
Possibly three.
You consider three, right.
But now's the issue, Katherine. Can you separate 3 second two? Can you?
From what?
Can you measure them distinctly?
Okay, from what I've seen, in virtual reality environments, they measure immersion, engagement, and presence, basically.
Well, that's going to be your contribution, is that you are going to take this emerging world one step further, and you're going to begin to sort of separate those things out. Because we all know, at a conceptual level, that they're very different things. Just because it's hard to measure them doesn't mean that they don't exist.
Let me toss out an idea. You said, jumping a little ahead, that you are going to do principal component analysis. Well, when you do that, the questions will naturally group. Hopefully we have a natural logical explanation. So if from that work it comes clear that you have 3 distinct groups of questions, plus among other things, corresponding to those 3 elements, then you have it. You don't need to decide in advance if there is no literature clear indication which question belongs to which group.
Although that can be so tied to the particular data. It's
Right.
much better.
Well,
You really, it goes.
You'd much rather have a group of questions
Yeah.
that you put together that you believe a priori relate to engagement, presence, and immersion. Then you get your data, you do your analysis, and lo and behold, they all fall out, and life is good.
Or you work on both ends, but you do need to conceptualize it up front. Because I was going to say that when you get to regression models, wasn't clear what that was. It's like with Kenneth's, we talked about, you really need to clearly specify the models and how they connect.
But she did talk about doing a reliability analysis, which do exactly that, pre-specified.
And you're right, what you have up here is not the psychological measure of engagement. This is the process. What you have up here, this is the process by which one engenders engagement. But what does it mean to be engaged? How would you measure the level of engagement of an individual with a particular test?
I actually didn't look at it that way because I was more focused on considering the...
So we just distinguished, excuse me, Kevin, Joyce just distinguished 2 kinds of engagements. Sort of the psychological sensation of engagement versus the features of the virtual environment that promote engagement. Is there a similar distinction on presence? Is there a psychological? Presence is purely psychological, right?
Purely psychological.
Okay. Could it be an extra hypothesis that the psychological engagement is distinct from the presence engagement, and it's something we test to see if they're different or they're the same?
I got this. If I could make an additional hypothesis in which I can test if engagement is different. Psychological engagement is different from psychological.
See, you can expand this because, to me, your model is virtual worlds that have certain characteristics, because I'm sure you can have some good virtual worlds and some bad virtual worlds, depending on the functionality. But what you're saying is virtual worlds that do these things, that provide feedback, okay, will create a psychological state in the user of engagement. And by being engaged, the user then, that leads to presence. I'm paraphrasing what you said, psychological presence. And those those two psychological states now will lead to enhanced collaborative e-learning.
Okay. I actually was more focused on the measuring how the psychological, how presence could enhance collaborative learning.
So what I understood, you're sort of using presence to cover the psychological state. And you're
Yes.
using the term engagement to cover features of the
The
environment.
environment. Yes, that's how I.
And what we're bringing out here is that there's this extra psychological.
And I'm just paraphrasing what you said. You said that presence and engagement are two separate things. You know, we're in the other world, in a non-virtual world, being present, you had that presence before engagement. You said, no, no, no. In a virtual world, first of all, you have to engender this engagement before you do presence.
Through the characteristics of the virtual world, you have to involve the user in the participation. But the way I've been looking at it is that the virtual worlds that I'm considering are the 3D models of virtual worlds that incorporate the characteristics of engagement that I previously mentioned. So I'm giving engagement as it if the virtual world has the characteristics to foster the engagement.
So how do you know if a user's engaged or not? It fosters it, right?
Well,
I mean, I can put a student in a classroom and I can do all kinds of things. How would I know that they're engaged?
well, if they have a high sense of presence, they have to be engaged. Okay, so what I'm trying to measure is that the virtual world have the characteristics. Does that characteristic get them to feel psychological sense of being there? And by being there already, by getting the presence, the sense of presence, the user has to be engaged.
Okay, now summarize what you've heard from the committee and your viewpoints and whether there's a difference.
Okay, let me see. From the committee, what I've heard is that I should measure engagement individually, psychological sense of engagement individually, separately, from measuring presence,
Psychological.
psychological. Okay. And my view is that when you measure presence in a virtual world, the user already has achieved that psychological sense of engagement.
That's your view. That sounds like an hypothesis.
Well, remember that, like I mentioned, presence, in order to develop presence in a virtual world, the user has to be engaged. So when you measure by measuring presence in a virtual world, you're also automatically measuring engagement up to a point. You don't need to divide them within this particular.
Richard?
Yeah, if you have different things going on, you need to do a model that shows how everything conceptually, hypothetically connects to each other. Or you have to eliminate some concepts.
Now, eventually, your design is to do a comparison with the non-virtual world, right?
When I'm going to compare with a non-virtual world, is just the performance.
We sometimes call that the real world. The non-virtual world also works.
But the only thing that I'm using the traditional learning setting is to compare the performance on the collaborative staff against the performance on the collaborative staff of the users that are using virtual, the learning